higher gossip.
Yeah, I guess in that way, how do you put words to the act of just like loving somebody in a particular way? All the words are just approximations that make you sound like you're full of shit.
Right. And do you
But
feel...
at the core, it's that. At the core, it's that. It's like just to be with somebody and feel moved by them and feel hurt with them and have your heart activated with somebody else. That's the beauty of what I do for a living.
And do you feel that love plays a role in that, in how you relate to each of these people?
The podcast begins with a discussion of the American psychologist James Hillman.
Well, his idea was the whole construct of therapy. Like he wanted to take therapy outside of the consulting room.
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, Hillman kind of became a public intellectual. But for me, that is one of the sort of contradictions that at first felt like a issue, but isn't really. It just seems like it on its face.
What do you mean it seems like it on its face, but it isn't?
Well, the problem, I mean, it's not that we shouldn't feel sort of some sense of privacy or have some idea of the sacredness of our own experience, that we don't just want to like share it with everyone else. It's just that if we take these things as sort of the unexamined truth that, you know, what's personal to me is something that I'm going to protect, or else like I'm in danger, then, you know, we can kind of take our own experience a little too literally, a little too seriously. But if you can hold it more loosely, then you can still do your thing, whatever that is, just trying to be aware that it's sort of the surface level is not the most meaningful aspect of it. You're just, does that make sense? So like therapy is just one.
Can you give an example or like?
Yeah. So someone comes in to therapy and tells me that they are feeling depressed, and you know, they typically come in with all sorts of expectations about what's going to happen when we meet. Maybe they come in thinking, okay, if they share with me what's going on with them, then together we will analyze the source of this depression, and like once they discover what the source of it is, then they will somehow be healed from that or redeemed from that. So, you know, that's then the two of us are kind of engaging in a very particular ritual, which is a valid one, but to kind of hold it loosely and be aware that this is the game we're playing, and not think that this is the ultimate truth of what therapy is and what depression is. You know, it's sort of like, it's a certain approach to emotions. And the question is sort of, what's the most meaningful or useful approach in any particular circumstance?
Maybe I'm being dense. I don't see the relation to the question of public versus private emotion. If
you think of depression as sort of a medical condition that prevents you from functioning, then you want to go see a doctor about it.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Or a therapist about it. If you think of it as, your blue period,
right,
then maybe you make a painting about it.
And that's sort of making a story about your emotions that you can present to the public. Would you say that's fair to say?
Yeah. And I think there's certain emotions that really, like, if you follow the story that they're private, that can trap you, because you start to feel like sort of ashamed of being human, and that alienates you. And then you go see somebody once a week, and that's your private space where you can bare yourself in this way.
Did you follow the Nexium guy at all?
Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about, I'm thinking two things. There is obviously some tremendous uplift that can be created by sharing one's secrets and one's emotions. Thus, we have the practice of confession, which has existed in the Catholic Church for thousands of years. Thus, we have therapy, which obviously has very salutary effects on many people. I guess when I have somebody trying to make or suggesting that everyone's emotions be public, I feel a culty sense, because that's also that's also obviously a very useful tactic for being able to control people, because you can say, like, and that's what priests were able to do as well to some degree. There's a balance, and it obviously requires a great deal of moral scrupulosity from the person who's receiving the confession in order to take on that responsibility. Because when you provide it to somebody else, you can say, okay, at worst, maybe you're saying, okay, I won't be the judge of what this emotion is. Sort of, you can be the judge, or you can be the leader of my emotion. And there's something very powerful about being the person to whom somebody unburdens themselves.
It's so true. Yeah.
Did you follow that case? Are you interested in cult leaders at all?
Oh my God, who isn't?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. What do you think was going on?
That's an interesting thing to talk about.
Like, do you think he thought he was doing good for these people?
I can't imagine. I can't quite imagine what it's like to be such a sociopath like that. Like, for me, even in my darkest times, I always had my conscience. But I feel like a guy like that was just somewhere along the line, he lost that. So it was just pure sort of urge for power and sex and attention and adulation. Like, we're inhibited by that voice on our shoulder. Sure. And in some way, some people just don't have that. Those are the really dangerous people.
Right.
I guess that's sort of,
Yeah, that's one reading.
Personality disorder way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
Why? What's your take on it?
Well, I would have to assume that when he started out, he believed he was doing good for the people who came to see him. I think, I guess
not this guy. I mean, this guy started as, he was like, he started in multi-level marketing. I mean, he started with pure sort of manipulation, and then he came across this woman who was into neuro-linguistic programming and all that.
Oh yeah,
shit, and they came up with a great business model.
I guess
I really think that whole world is sort of the dark side of what I do.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that you bring that up.
Did you watch Wild Wild Country as well?
Oh yeah. I think I've watched all of those.
Yeah. Okay. I haven't watched the Nexium one, but I've read the articles. That's another one where I really do feel like Osho did have a spiritual revelation. Maybe that's a better example.
That one's different. Yeah. I think that one's different.
But
that one I would call, or how would you describe what happened there?
Well, my basic instinct is that the same thing, it's the same thing, which is that, when you level up such that you have a little bit more spiritual power, you're faced with several temptations. And this is what the temptations of Christ symbolize. I think Jung talks about this. Christ as this person who's becoming fully integrated, or however you want to put it, leveling up, to use the jargon of the day. And then when you do that, you're faced with these great temptations, including the temptation to use that for power. But I think it's sort of the same side of, or a different side of the same coin, and that coin being thinking about interpersonal relations in a different way from most people do. I think when you start realizing that there's so much beneath the surface of what an everyday conversation is, between what everyday friendship is or everyday loving is, that unleashes power, which can be quite dangerous.
Yeah. And people call Jungian psychology, what I sort of am studying, a cult. There's a whole book, the Jung Cult.
Oh yeah.
And it's a really devastating accusation. I mean, you gotta take something like that seriously.
What do you think of their arguments? I'm not familiar with it.
Well, I guess in some technical sense, a cult involves, certain really manipulative, abusive tactics that make it really hard for you to leave. Where you feel like if you're not a member and don't follow the dear leader, then you are exiled into outer darkness. And that's not true of this world. But there is a similar, anytime a lot of energy centers around some personality, it brings out some weird stuff in people.
Yeah.
And I've seen that people, I was in AA for a bunch of years. There's that energy there. In all the religions I've tried, that's a part of it. That's a very unpleasant part of any sort of group movement. But being alone is hard too.
Yeah. And in a way that I feel like you almost just perfectly shed another light on what we were just talking about, which is that anytime you have this, I don't know, you can call it increased emotional resonance, magnetic resonance, that has to do with suffering and also with sort of going a little bit deeper beneath the surface, there's the opportunity for some, that can be played with in a light way and it can be played with in a dark way.
Yeah. And that's where I'm not some absolutist that thinks that you should share everything that goes on within you. But I am particularly suspicious of people who act like they have it all together. So that's why I like an artful disclosure of our humanness and awkwardness and embarrassing little things, because it sort of it protects against the inflation of some grand wizard type.
Right. I was just talking with my friend about middle school, and we were talking about the way that boys treat each other in middle school, or at least in the middle schools we went to. And also like torturing teachers. Like there was this poor teacher we made cry in my middle school.
Really?
Yeah. She started crying, and then you might like this, just from a psychological perspective. She got into the seat of a student. She tried to switch places, and she was like, "Okay, Zach, now you go up and teach the class." And then she started like heckling him while crying to try to make him understand how she was feeling. But of course, the class.
Oh my God, I could cry.
Of course, the class just, found this even more ridiculous, and probably she felt even more ridiculous.
Ugh.
But
wow.
But what? But I'm bringing this up because we were talking about how in a gang like this of middle school boys, if a weakness is spotted, you'll just hang on to that weakness as long as you can exploit it, right? And then we were thinking about the way that determines this way of not showing weakness, except with people you're very intimate with.
That's so right. Yeah. I never quite experienced that. But yeah, sometimes like when I've come across groups of guys like that.
Yeah.
It's so scary. I couldn't hang with that. I'm so glad I didn't go to a school like that, because I'm so sensitive to that sort of cruelty.
Yeah.
I would be like the teacher.
Right.
I wouldn't have been able to teach at a school like that.
Right. Yeah, I looked her up. She's still there. So maybe that's a happy ending. But yeah, I mean, it does. I hear you about, I think like there being these enormous dangers of repressing one's fallibility, obviously, because we're all so weak and fallible, just fundamentally as these like flesh bags. But I think, if your only option to make a living is like, to be working out on a construction site, it's a required skill to learn.
It's so true.
You think so? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I work with people in the military, police officers. There's certain professions where it's like I've had to learn that there's a whole different belief system around emotion and revealing, weakness, that it's a different kind of culture.
Sure.
And and when you're in that culture, I think it's respectful to play by those rules.
Right. I'm very interested in that. Is there something, I mean, I don't know how comfortable you are talking about your work with patients, or maybe you can do it in a more general way. I don't know. But what is it like working with police officers?
I love working with people for whom the whole therapy thing feels like a novel sort of approach. It's some of the most inspiring and beautiful work, because you can get really complacent and think, okay, I know the technique. I know how to understand and help people. And when you get into that sort of complacent state, you lose your inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
So when you work with somebody who you're like, whoa, like this is not what I was just sort of habituated to expecting, then you actually have to really try to empathize with their point of view. And like when I can feel, not to generalize, but the people I've worked with in those sorts of professions really are led by a sense of duty and honor, and like in a really cool way that I can kind of relate to, but it feels like their life is so guided by that. And it's cool to see that that's a valid and beautiful sort of ideal to live by. It's hard to find how does the whole therapy world fit with that ideal.
Do you have an opinion different on that?
I think first, it's just to really listen. And like, one thing you're trained in school for psychotherapy is how to actively listen. And just by listening, you affect somebody.
Yeah, that rings so true with me. And that's the core idea behind therapy that continues to ring so true with me, that Rogersian idea that the truth itself is curative. And just, yeah.
No, it's so true. I mean, drop all that other bullshit. At the end of the day, it's just that. If you love somebody and listen to them, that's pretty good.
You can do a whole lot worse.
Yeah, that's why it's weird for me to try to talk about it, because I don't really know what I'm talking about. But it's good practice.
Uh-huh. You mean maybe it's more in your muscle memory?
No, it's more like it's about listening.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I guess in that way, how do you put words to the act of just like loving somebody in a particular way? All the words are just approximations that make you sound like you're full of shit.
Right. And do you
But at the core, it's that. It's like just to be with somebody and feel moved by them and feel hurt with them and have your heart activated with somebody else. That's the beauty of what I do for a living.
And do you feel that love plays a role in that, in how you relate to each of these people?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say in terms of what do I do, there's the whole archetypal psychology thing. That's kind of the head piece of it. But ultimately, it comes from love and from the erotic element of relationship.
I think some people might
not sexual.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think some people might be surprised to hear the word erotic crop up in that context. Does that have a meaning to you that relates to archetypal psychology?
Yes. So, psychology comes from psyche. There's that myth of Psyche and Eros, Cupid and Psyche. Psyche being like the soul, Eros being the god of love. And in the myth, love sort of awakens Psyche to her development. So really in the archetypal psychology world, that kind of is the myth of it. It's through love, we help awaken the soulfulness of people. That's like maybe its most grandiose narrative of it. And then love awakens that part of you, and then that part of you suffers for love and develops through that suffering for love. I mean, it's kind of like that begins the whole process. And that's an experience that when I've worked with people who just haven't really ever been loved. Mm-hmm. I mean, just to see them, you can feel them like they've never been really seen that way. And it's miraculous what happens within a person, within all of us, when we are actually seen and loved.
That makes me want to ask you about the work you've done with couples. I know that you've done a fair amount of work relating to couples and couples therapy. And
yeah.
I wonder if you have anything to say about modern relationships. I've been thinking about these lately.
Oh my God, yeah.
What would you say is the number one problem that you see among couples? Or can it not be boiled down to one thing?
Or, sure it can. For me. Let's say I see a lot of people in their 20s, couples in their 20s, and who are in serious relationships, but don't have, marriage and kids and house and all the sort of adult responsibilities yet. And I feel like in that phase, I know I wasn't taught, and I think a lot of us weren't taught what the transition between sort of the romantic love of passion and, Cinderella and inspiration. How do you transition from that to the adult love that on its surface looks a lot less sort of divine,
and a lot less
but
sexy.
I think I even prefer the adult forms of love. I mean, I liked that feeling, but it's much more rewarding, I find, the more mature phases of it. So I love sort of helping people see the beauty of the more mundane types of phases of relationship, and even the phases that are full of conflict, even that stuff. So I think that's the one problem. That's the problem I see the most. We weren't taught how to understand adult love. Were you? I wasn't.
Of course not.
We certainly weren't modeled. Not many people were modeled that by their parents either.
What would you say are the steps towards A, learning about that, but B, enacting it?
Well, I feel like as individuals, both people need to have some degree of, stability and autonomy. That's number one. Which, I mean, sometimes people meet when they're 15 and they're still together when they're 25. So it's like they've grown up together in a way. But even then, if each person doesn't have their own sort of foundation as an individual, then you can't do much until that's achieved. Then I think it's about learning how to tolerate not having things go your way, and even learn to enjoy that. How do you relate to a sense of not being the master of your life? And I guess maybe that's for the type of person who's independent minded. Maybe there's another type who just wants somebody to guide them. They have to learn how to find their footing.
Right, that's just what I was going to ask. I thought that was an interesting idea, that both members of a couple should learn not to be the master of their lives. Is that how you conceptualize it?
Yeah, I mean, I know that in my life and in my marriage, so much of the beautiful stuff of my life comes from what Alex brings that is not my wouldn't be my instinct and isn't my forte. But since I sort of let go and respect her and we're a team, I have all this stuff in my life that I wouldn't have been able on my own to ever achieve.
Right.
And I bet she would say the same.
Right.
That's where I feel like the partnership is such an asset if you've got a good one.
That makes a lot of sense. That a true partnership is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. And I think probably in some, whatever sociological way, that's a new thing that a lot of people are kind of developing without much precedent, is a real partnership in a relationship. Typically it was divided roles.
Right.
A man and a woman, this is what the woman does, this is what the man does. And don't ask questions.
And do you think partnership...
Now it's not like that.
And do you think partnership was not possible under those, under that model of divided roles?
I think it is. I mean, let's say there's some very traditional patriarchal marriage where the man is the breadwinner and the woman is in charge of the home. Those still exist.
Of course.
And I don't think those are inherently unhealthy or something like that. But if I see a couple like that, I personally find it important to at least have each of them acknowledge that that's what they're in. Mm-hmm. To state the terms. These are the terms of our relationship. This is what I do. This is what you do. We're both into that?
Right.
Then I think it's sort of a conscious partnership, Then same applies to open relationships or polyamorous relationships or whatever, as long as there's a conscious agreement between everyone, then it's a partnership. But I guess kind of the more egalitarian kind of sharing and questioning traditional gender roles, that feels like that's a newish thing in history that we're all struggling how to figure out.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think what's often creates such controversy, it seems to me, is the obscurity of the agreement, right? It's not formalized. I mean, you have an agreement and you're like, okay, are we staying together for the purpose of getting married and having kids? Or is it just, we're tired of going out to clubs and looking for new people to fuck?
Exactly. And often people don't want to admit what they have sort of in effect agreed to.
Right.
And once I get them to admit, no judges, no judges, but let's just talk about what's going on here. This is what's happening, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, that is. And once you admit that, often you have to look in the mirror in a different way. That's often why people don't agree to it explicitly.
Is there a more common role that you're seeing that people are taking on without formalizing that role? Is there a pattern that crops up over and over again?
I mean, just anecdotally, I notice that men in heterosexual relationships, we are way behind the women when it comes to having a sense of responsibility for something beyond, our own immediate interests. So the women just kind of take for granted that this is how guys are. We're kind of selfish and immature, and therefore like a lot of stuff is tolerated from the young men I see in the couples that is not good for the men, not good for the women. But there's some assumption that that's the best that guys can do. So it's funny how I feel like it is a result of some sexism, but it's a kind that really holds men back. Women, just totally generalizing from my experience, they're much more conscientious and caring and responsible than the young men. And that creates an imbalance that is often like tricky to adjust. But when you do adjust it, it really helps both people.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense, or does that sound
Sure.
ridiculous? I mean, I don't know.
No, it doesn't sound ridiculous. I wonder just generally, are these couples childless, or do they have children?
Oh no, yeah, I'm talking like 20s, right after college, kind of trying to figure out life.
Right. Well, what it makes me think of is just, some of the obvious differences between our generation and, say, our grandparents' generation. And a lot of those differences you can find at least a correlation with the advent of birth control, right? Like in our grandparents' generation, if you're going to start sleeping together, there's a basic assumption that very likely will result in the production of children, to put it clinically. So what I wonder about is whether it might be harder for men for my grandfather, it was like he had a girlfriend, and then he had a wife, and then he had a kid. I don't know, he was 23, 24. And I think for most people, unless you are really, truly disturbed, that's a kick in the pants to be like, yes, something beyond me exists.
Right.
And I wonder if it's that without that, it is hard for men to sort of get that kick in the pants.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree. Yeah, often what has happened is through therapy, that's the kick in the pants.
Mm-hmm.
And you try to do it, you try to gently sort of initiate them into this thing. I know I needed my own version of a kick in the pants.
Which was what?
Yeah. For me, that was having to get sober.
Yeah.
So you're saying served as...
No, sorry, I was just going to make a joke. I was going to say, you're saying as a therapist, you're a kicker of pants.
That's a thing I do. It's not, I never imagined myself doing that, but I do a lot of kicking in the pants. Yeah. It's not fun. I think some people really like doing that. I don't like doing that.
Like scared straight, you go into the...
Like I've done like a bunch of interventions. Yeah, I scare straight sometimes.
Do you think you're scary in those situations?
No, how could I be scary? I'm totally not scary. I'm a little wussy. I try to be.
You could get like one of those like things that sort of like make your voice like the Bane voice, or like the Batman voice.
No, I mean typically it involves the application of leverage.
Yeah.
Speak softly but carry a big stick sort of way.
I was reading recently a little essay by Robert Graves about the word genius. And he gave an etymological definition of genius and related it basically to something very much like a guardian angel. Right? So So thinking back to how the word used to be used before modern times, your genius was not you, but it was more like a genie or a spirit.
Yeah, I love that.
And yeah, in my notes, I just wanted to add, I wrote that down because I wanted to ask you about genius and how you think about genius, but also how you think about inspiration, because I know you're somebody who has experienced inspiration. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. And and how that relates to your own experiences in life as a therapist, but also just as a person.
No, I mean that sort of classical meaning of genius was such a revelation when I saw that. I think that writer Elizabeth Gilbert, she has a good TED talk on that. Really? And my man James Hillman, he has a whole book about that too. But it's I feel like that's another one of these things that I wish I was taught earlier on, that whatever that force is that gives us ideas is not us.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes to different people in all different kinds of ways, but it can come through new experiences, through suffering, through attention, through love, through drugs, through connecting with people. But when it comes, I think we just have to listen to it. And I think the two risks for me have been, one, taking it literally and thinking that it's me. That leads to ugly places like madness or megalomania or ridiculous narcissism. Or on the flip side, disregarding it, denying it as silly or impractical or childish, which just leads to kind of numbness and deadness. So I think that's where being able to sort of hear that voice or however you experience that and cultivate that is something that I think is essential for a lot of people, for a creative type of person. I think that's like, if you want to feel happy, if you have a genius like that, you got to learn how to bring it into your life somehow. But that force can enter while you're changing diapers or, on a construction site. It doesn't have to be tortured in your garret, like,
right,
with a, opium stem hanging out of your mouth.
Why do you think it does have some correlation with drugs?
I think, again, it goes back to emotion and mood and the way those are related to images and beauty and whatever that source of inspiration is. Somehow it really affects our mood, this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at first drugs can sort of synthetically create a mood, or they can synthetically remove some emotion, and you start to think that these chemicals, can actually connect to this source that just you're feeling its symptoms in the mood going on. Right. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's like a drug is a really big trampoline, and you can get on it and go really high. But, what you actually want to be doing is building a ladder.
Yeah.
And that ladder comes from like Graves, for instance, thought that you could not be a poet without being a good person. a morally good person, which
I
is
love
an
that.
interesting take. Like, because otherwise you would be defrauding your genius, he put it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'd never heard that moral piece of it.
Yeah.
I agree with that 1,000%. Though I feel like then there wouldn't be many. A lot of the poets that we think of as great poets would no longer be up in that canon.
I think he also said that there were no more than 15 real poets in the English language in history. So to give you a sense of his scrupulous discernment. Do you think that madness also relates to genius? Is it that, like, maybe instead of taking a trampoline, you've taken a rocket ship and then you get stranded out in space?
I think madness happens when you take the genius literally.
Mm.
You know, like you think that you are the genius, or you think that the poems are not metaphors, but somehow like the actual truth. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I remember that section from Carl Jung's Red Book. I believe it's the Red Book where a woman from his imagination is trying to convince him that he's an artist.
Yeah.
And he's resisting. He's saying, "No, I'm a psychologist. I'm not an artist. Don't try to trick me into thinking that I'm an artist." What is that all about?
Yeah, well, I don't know, that's a funny moment where he had some idea that an artist, he had some mythic idea of what an artist was, that it was like Goethe or something like that, which I guess sounds like that's what Graves kind of thought too. But
I think so, yeah. Well, yeah.
So if he were an artist, then that would be him telling himself that he's this great, great man in a way that he felt would have led to that sort of inflation of that madness. But I mean, he was an artist. It was just that funny old romantic capital A idea that we still have that legacy of. But back in the day when the genius was just a spirit that lived in your workshop, you didn't have to be Michelangelo. You could have, just been like a regular artisan, and everyone had that. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, maybe not everyone, maybe everyone, I don't know. Graves.
But if you worked in the craft somehow.
Yes. Well, because, something like carpentry, just like poetry, was infused with magic. That was Graves's belief. So his basic theory was that poetry was a remnant of the pre-Abrahamic religions. And these were magical cults in which language was infused with magic, dance was infused with magic, carpentry was infused with magic.
Hell yeah. And then this literal idea of the genius it really has corrupted that for so many people.
Yeah.
It's so sad. It really screwed me up about it. Yeah, I mean, it's just, there is that kind of magic that we all have access to and can experience. It doesn't have to be like this privileged realm for the elect great men sort of thing.
Right. I suppose where that comes from is that, like anything else, you do need to build the ladder. You do need to be a technician in a way to have greater powers. And then it's sort of people put the cart before the horse and think that it's all about this, intense erudition that makes you the genius. Or it's just like, no, if I want to make nice to my genius, of course I want to study, the things that are relevant to my craft. That was an interesting sigh.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I feel like is very, very important. Doesn't this make you feel sort of emotional to think about this whole story, this whole thing?
Sometimes it does. I think it doesn't right now because half of me is still thinking about trying to make this podcast good. Is Jon having a good time? Have I covered everything that was in my notes? So, yeah. But I will often really have that very mysterious...
You can't even have that kind of emotion in this public forum? No emotion around personal...
I didn't say it was verboten or that I was incapable of it, merely that at this specific moment it's not occurring. It's a simple statement of concrete fact, you know.
No, a podcast it's kind of like particle physics. It's an objective realm that can't be tainted by feeling.
Oh, you're being sarcastic.
The corruption of feeling.
No, I don't think that, but I will say this, like, as with great art, often I think the podcasts that seem most natural or most off the cuff